America's at a crossroads, folks. After years of open borders, a government that puts foreign interests above its own people, and a media that only reports what fits their agenda, we're not just drifting, we're being led into disaster. The question is, will we wake up before it's too late, or are we going to keep sleepwalking off the edge? Because right now, as we speak, countless people are being slaughtered in Syria, including many Christians, massacred, entire families wiped out. But you wouldn't know that if you only watched mainstream news. They don't care. They never have. But here's the thing. This isn't just a Middle Eastern problem. This is a warning for the West, because the same forces responsible for that bloodshed, they're already here. And if history teaches us anything, it's that civilizations that refuse to defend themselves don't last long. So today we're breaking it down, what's happening in Syria, what it means for the West, and why, if we don't wake up, we're next.
Syria's interim leader is calling for national unity after days of clashes and revenge killings in areas traditionally loyal to the ousted President Bashar al-Assad. Ahmed al-Sharaa described the violence in coastal regions as an expected challenge, while a British-based war monitoring organisation says that more than 1,000 people have been killed over the past few days, most of them civilians who were shot dead by security forces. Now, they're trying to crush an armed rebellion in the province of Latakia, the heartland of Syria's Alawite minority, and a base of support from the former President Bashar al-Assad, who was deposed and fled the country in December.
Security forces rounding up alleged supporters of the ousted Assad regime, some subjected to brutal beatings, homes of Alawites looted and set alight. The images coming out of Syria's coastal regions are shocking and reportedly show just a fraction of the atrocities committed there. 4 days of sectarian violence has left bodies piled up in the streets around Latakia and Tartus, home to many Alawites, the Shia minority sect former President Bashar al-Assad belonged to. Syria's new rulers had promised they would be safe with no revenge killings. But after a string of hit-and-run attacks on the country's new security forces, came Thursday's coordinated ambush by fighters loyal to the Assad regime, the biggest challenge so far to Syria's new rulers. The interim government's call for reinforcements led to thousands of fighters converging on the coast from all over the country. Then the revenge killings began, with hundreds of civilians murdered, many of them families targeted for being Alawite.
The violence began after Assad loyalists ambushed government forces on Thursday. Government supporters then arrived, and these pictures are believed to show them fighting the Alawites. An estimated thousands Alawites have been killed, including women and children. These killings have caused anger across the country, including in the capital Damascus.
People have gathered here in protest against the violence and against the killing. They are chanting, all Syrians are standing together in solidarity and in support of the victims of the Alawite community, but also in support of unity of this government. They're calling for prosecution, they're calling for justice and avoid any violence in the country.
So we are here just in the stand, to express peacefully that we are against the killing of the civilians from all parts, against the killing of the police and the other civilians.
Some of the protesters began calling for revenge.
The police is firing in the air to disperse the protesters as there is tension coming.
Now, why isn't American media covering any of this? Over 1,000 people have been slaughtered in Syria in the last 72 hours, many of them Christian and Alawite civilians. The press and the so-called human rights organizations, silent, because acknowledging this violence doesn't fit their narrative. Anyway, to recap, Syria's new interim leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, is calling for unity after what they're calling revenge killings. But the reality, this is all seeming more like a purge. The former stronghold of Bashar al-Assad, the Alawite coastal regions of Latakia and Tartus, have become mass graves. Security forces are rounding up anyone suspected of loyalty to Assad's regime, executing them in the streets, looting their homes, and wiping out entire families. And here's the part they really don't want you to know. This isn't just about politics. It's about religion. The Alawites, a Shia minority, have long been persecuted by Sunni jihadists, and alongside them, Christians. Because whenever power shifts in the Middle East, one thing remains constant: Christians always pay the price. We just saw the images coming out of Syria, bodies in the street, homes burned, entire communities erased. But the global media, they're busy talking about sectarian clashes and security forces cracking down. They won't call it what it is, a massacre. And if history teaches us anything, what happens there won't stay there. Every time the West ignores Christian persecution abroad, it creeps closer to home. First, it was the Middle East, then attacks on churches in Europe, and now the same forces responsible for this bloodshed are already inside our borders. This isn't a secret to most people who are plugged in. Europe is in freefall. The continent that once stood as the cultural and spiritual backbone of Western civilization is now unrecognizable. Decades of unchecked migration, political cowardice, and a wholesale rejection of its Christian roots have left Europe vulnerable to the very forces that once sought to conquer it. And unlike past generations who fought back, today's leaders have chosen surrender. Now, this isn't the first time Europe has been at the edge of collapse. In the early medieval period, large parts of the Iberian Peninsula were conquered by the Moors, and much of Eastern Europe was under threat from Ottoman expansion. The Reconquista, which lasted for nearly 800 years, was Europe's answer to that existential crisis, a long, bloody, but ultimately victorious struggle to reclaim the land, culture, and faith that had been overrun. The Crusades were another reaction to an Islamic expansion that threatened to wipe Christianity off the map. Whether you agree with their methods or not, the reality is simple. When Europe was confronted with the possibility of total subjugation, it fought back, and it won. Fast forward to today, and the situation is eerily similar, but this time there's no fight, no organized resistance, just a slow, pathetic capitulation. The same cities that once stood as symbols of European strength and identity are now struggling under the weight of parallel societies that do not assimilate and do not respect the values that built these nations. London, Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, each one facing an internal demographic and cultural shift that is unprecedented in history. These are not immigrants arriving with the intent of joining the national fabric. These are communities setting up separate legal, cultural, and religious structures that fundamentally oppose the Western model of governance and society. And yet, European leadership refuses to acknowledge what is happening. In fact, they go out of their way to silence anyone who does. France, which has seen its suburbs transform into de facto no-go zones where French law is ignored in favor of Islamic courts, continues to push for more migration, more integration efforts that have repeatedly failed. Sweden, once the safest country in Europe, now has the highest gun violence rate per capita in the region, largely due to imported gang warfare. Germany itself is seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism, not from neo-Nazis, as the media would have you believe, but from migrants who were brought in under the guise of humanitarianism. Meanwhile, Christian communities are in decline. Churches that have stood for centuries are closing at record rates, some even being converted into mosques, while state-backed institutions discourage public expression of faith in the name of secularism. This isn't just cultural decay, it's a targeted dismantling of everything that made Europe what it was, because a secular, relativist, and morally confused society is one that cannot resist anything. So what does this mean for America? Everything. Because the same blueprint that destroyed Europe is being followed here. The same push for mass migration without assimilation, the same suppression of traditional values, the same political class that refuses to protect its own people. And that's because for decades, the political elite have sold to the American people a lie that open borders, multiculturalism, and tolerance at all costs would lead to a stronger, more unified society. Instead, we've gotten more crime, more economic instability, and the importation of ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to Western civilization and its freedoms. Just like Europe, we are now seeing entire communities form parallel societies, refusing to assimilate, operating under their own rules, and bringing with them the same conflicts and hostilities they fled from in the first place. And this isn't just speculation, it's literally happening right now. Over the past few months, pro-Hamas protests have erupted across major U.S. cities, with demonstrators openly advocating for violent resistance and embracing radical ideologies that seek to destabilize the country from within. These protests, often framed as general anti-colonial or anti-imperialist movements, have merged with broader extremist currents in American academia, media, and activist circles. What began as rallies supposedly in solidarity with Gaza have rapidly transformed into open calls for revolution against the U.S. itself, with protesters openly chanting against America, praising terrorist tactics, and demanding the dismantling of Western institutions. The fact that these demonstrations are not only tolerated, but actively encouraged in elite institutions like Columbia reveals just how deeply anti-American sentiment has taken root. At the same time, a coordinated online influence campaign is working to normalize these extremist narratives and shift public opinion. Platforms like Reddit, X, and TikTok have been flooded with content aimed at radicalizing young, impressionable users into adopting anti-American viewpoints under the guise of activism. Much of this propaganda follows a deliberate pattern, distorting historical context, demonizing the U.S., and justifying acts of violence as a necessary resistance. This isn't happening organically. Extremist networks, foreign actors, and ideological agitators are exploiting digital platforms to manufacture consent for domestic unrest, using the same online manipulation tactics that have been used to destabilize other nations. The goal is clear: erode national unity, delegitimize American institutions, and create an environment where political violence becomes normalized. The real question is, how long before this manufactured outrage turns into real, coordinated domestic attacks? Under the Biden administration, we saw record-breaking levels of illegal immigration, with over 10 million people crossing the border in just 4 years. That's the equivalent of adding an entire new state to the country overnight. And the consequences are already visible. Cartels operating with impunity, fentanyl flooding our streets, cities overwhelmed with migrants who are being prioritized over American citizens, and now the warnings are turning into reality. The FBI and Homeland Security have repeatedly warned about terror threats coming through the southern border. Yet when confronted with these concerns, the response from the American ruling class is the same as Europe's: deny, distract, and demonize anyone who speaks up. Meanwhile, the people who built this country, the ones who value faith, tradition, and law and order, are being treated like the real threat. The same media that ignores radical Islamist attacks has no problem labeling Christians as extremists. Parents who question the indoctrination of their kids are put on watch lists. Law-abiding gun owners are treated as potential domestic terrorists. It's the same story we saw in Europe, demonizing people who want to preserve this country while enabling those who seek to tear it down. All that to say that the West is on the brink, and the root of it all is one undeniable truth. This is a spiritual war. The collapse we're witnessing isn't just political, it's not just economic, it's not just about borders, crime, or culture. Those are all symptoms of a much deeper disease. If you abandon God, you will pay the price. Just look at history. Civilizations don't fall because of external threats alone. They rot from within first. Rome collapsed long before the barbarians sacked it because it had abandoned its founding principles. Europe fell to invasion time and time again when it lost faith and embraced decadence. And now the West, America included, is teetering on that same edge. The rejection of God has left a void, and something always fills that void. In the West's case, that's been the state. The state has become the religion of choice for a lot of people who have fallen for the cultural Marxist propaganda and adopted secularism and moral relativism as their modus operandi. That's why right now it's lawlessness, radical ideologies, and a culture of self-destruction. You cannot have a functioning nation without a moral foundation, and you cannot have a moral foundation without God. There's no political solution to a spiritual problem, which means if we don't turn back, there's no saving this civilization. And that starts with every single one of us. We have to get right with God, repent, pray, strengthen our faith. Stop expecting politicians to fix a problem that is fundamentally moral in nature. If people do not wake up spiritually, it won't matter what policies are in place. The destruction will continue. Every great revival in history started with individuals turning back to God. And if there is any hope of pulling America back from the edge, it will come from the faithful who refuse to bend to this era's degeneracy. But faith alone is not enough. You must be ready physically, because this war is not just spiritual. It is unfolding in real time in our cities, our schools, our communities. The enemies are already here. Whether it's imported radicalism, the rise of organized crime, or an establishment actively working against its own people, you must be prepared. That means defending Christianity, speaking up. Expose how the media ignores Christian persecution worldwide. Call out the politicians who refuse to protect believers while bending over backwards for every other group. The world is at war with Christianity, and silence is complicity. And you don't even have to look that much further than the opening of the last Olympics. It's as though the secular intelligentsia has been screaming at everybody who will notice that they are trying to undo the fabric that has made the West so incredibly successful, and that is Christian principles of freedom and equality. It also means standing ready. Be vigilant. The communities that survive are the ones that see the warning signs and prepare. Secure your home. Know who's in your neighborhood. Train yourself and your family to not be helpless. And most importantly, and I don't want to get any more dramatic, but we all have to prepare for hardship. Economic collapse, civil unrest, and internal attacks aren't some far-off paranoid fantasy. They're already happening. The dollar is weakening. The political divide is deepening. Criminal networks are operating openly in major cities. You need to be self-sufficient. Get your food, your security, and your community in order. Because when the system fails, it will be every man for himself. At the end of the day, this isn't just about politics. This isn't just about war. This is about survival, and it starts with you. Reality is, the world is burning, and people are still pretending this is just another political crisis. But what we're witnessing, what's unfolding before our very eyes, is something far greater than just another cycle of war and chaos. This is a battle between belief and unbelief, between faith and darkness. And right now, darkness is advancing because the West has abandoned what made it strong. Mark 16:16 lays it out plainly. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. That verse isn't just about individual salvation. It speaks to what happens when entire nations turn away from God. A civilization without faith cannot stand. It may last for a while on the momentum of past generations, but eventually the rot sets in, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The Middle East is on fire, but the West is not safe. Not because of external threats alone, but because it has hollowed itself out spiritually. It has replaced faith with materialism, replaced moral conviction with moral relativism, and replaced the pursuit of righteousness with the pursuit of comfort. Look at Europe. Once the heart of Christendom, now a place where churches are abandoned, morality is mocked, and secularism rules. And the result? It is now being overtaken by those who still believe in something, no matter how dark their belief is. And again, America is following the same path. The Bible warns us what happens when people refuse to wake up. Ezekiel 33 tells us, if the watchman sees a sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, the blood will be on his hands. The warnings have been there for decades. The West has been given every sign that its trajectory is leading to collapse. Yet its leaders, its institutions, and even many of its people refuse to acknowledge the truth. They mock God, they reject faith, and they believe that a civilization can survive without the very foundation that built it. And now, the sword's here. Revelation 6 tells us that the persecution of the faithful is a sign of the times. It's happening now, as we saw in the beginning of the video. Christians are being slaughtered, imprisoned, and silenced worldwide. And Western governments, rather than standing in defense of faith, are actively working to suppress it. We're in an era where people who built the civilization are being treated as its greatest enemies, while those who wish to see it destroyed are being welcomed with open arms. Again, this isn't just a war on politics. This is a spiritual war. And we're witnessing the consequences of a world that has rejected God. A civilization that rejects God doesn't just fall. It is conquered by those who still believe in something, no matter how dark that belief is. The question is, will the West wake up and return to faith, or will it let itself be overtaken, just as so many nations before it? Now, all that being said, despite everything, despite the corruption, the decay, and the betrayal by those in power, I believe in America. Not in the government, not in the institutions that have been hijacked by bureaucrats, but in the principles that built this nation and the people who still hold them dear. America was never meant to be just another empire that rises and falls. It was founded on the idea that freedom comes from God, that rights are not granted by rulers, and that the people, when awakened, have the power to set things right. That foundation hasn't disappeared. It's been buried under decades of lies, but it's still there, waiting for those who are willing to dig deep enough to reclaim it. I believe that the indomitable American spirit is still alive, that morally righteous people will rise up, not through riots or destruction, but through conviction, through faith, and through the refusal to surrender to a system that has turned against them. I believe that people are waking up, that the complacency that allowed this collapse to take root is beginning to wear off, and that soon, those who have stayed silent will no longer sit on the sidelines. This is not the end of America. It's the breaking point before the fight to take it back. And if history has shown us anything, it's that when righteous people stand together, we win. You tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.